everyone a few minutes to join us here both on the webinar interface and on the phone. But in the meantime, I have a couple of housekeeping considerations for you. So please be sure that you have muted your line or muted your phone. You can do this through the drop-down menu under the little phone icon at the very top of your screen. So you should see a little microphone there. If you click it, it will mute it, and then you'll see a little green microphone icon with a line through it. So please be sure to mute yourself for the first part of the webinar, though rest assured there will be opportunities for questions towards the end. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And once I start the actual webinar, the chat box will disappear until the end, but you'll have an opportunity to enter some questions at that time, and there'll also be an opportunity for you to unmute yourself and ask a question using your voice instead of your fingers as well near the end of the webinar. So we'll just give it a few more minutes and then we'll get started.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Oh, hi.
Hi. Are you listening in for the webinar?
We are.
Yeah, okay, great. I am actually with the Alzheimer Society. Have you been able to hear Julie at all?
No.
No? Okay, 1 second and I'll work on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it *6 to mute? There's all these other meetings going on.
Okay, let's get started. So hi everyone, my name is Julie Robillard. I'm here with you for the next hour to talk about dementia research. I hope all of you can hear me okay. There is no video of me, although hopefully you can see the slides that I'll be showing on your screen. And so just a quick reminder to please mute your line for the first portion of the webinar. You can do that by clicking the little green microphone button on the top of your screen, and if it shows up with a line through it, then that means you've successfully managed to mute your line. So we'll be speaking today about dementia research, and I want to, before I get started, acknowledge the participation of Frank Everett, Jim Mann, and Ian Goldman, and contributed some content to this presentation. So let us get started without further ado. So I always like to start my presentations by acknowledging the various participants who have generously contributed their time, insights, and efforts into the research that we conduct, as well as the trainees in my lab, which is called the Neuroscience Engagement and Smart Tech Lab, or the NEST at UBC. And I'm very grateful to my affiliations as well as the people who fund the work that I do. And we'll talk a little bit about who those organizations are. But I just wanted to acknowledge the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, AgeWell, National Centers of Excellence, as well as the Alzheimer's Society of British Columbia, who is hosting this webinar today. So I'm just going through some technical considerations right now. Of course, there's always a little bit of wiggle room at the beginning. So we're just going to get started in 1 minute. Okay, so let us start with an outline. So for the next little while, I will be talking about what research actually is. Then we'll talk about why participate in research. We'll talk a little bit about what it's like to participate in research. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end on what you should look for when you're reading about research on the internet or in the news. And so let us, without further ado, get started here. So the first topic I want to cover is what is research? So here's a definition for you that I found online. Research is the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. So that is definitely a bit of a mouthful, and I had to read it about 7 times before I fully understood the definition. So what I propose to do is to unpack this definition bit by bit so we better understand what research is. So let's start by this idea that research is an investigation into something. Essentially what that means is that we are asking a question. We're asking a question that has not been asked before and that we're interested in answering through this process that we call research. So that's the first part, is most research projects have at the very start a research question that we're trying to answer. The second portion of this definition I want to look into is that research is also a study of materials and sources. And so in order to answer the question, we need to closely examine in great depth a range of different sources and materials to be able to answer the question. And this study, as a bit of a spoiler alert, usually takes a very long time because we want to do this very rigorously and, as I mentioned, very much in depth. The next part of the definition I want to look into is this idea that we need to study materials and sources. And those can be a whole range of different things. So for example, maybe my research question is, how is dementia portrayed in the media? And in that case, the study that I'll need to do will be of media content. So maybe I'll go looking for newspaper articles, or maybe I'll go looking for movies or TV shows that portray media. And that will be the materials and the sources that I use for my research. But maybe I want to understand through research the impact of a drug on a given tissue, maybe brain cells. And in that case, the easiest way to do that might be to use materials and sources from a model organism, such as an animal model. And that will then be the materials and sources that I use. Maybe another type of research is I'm interested in better understanding what the lived experience of dementia is, in which case I need to go talk to people who have that experience and that expertise. And so in that case, my materials and sources might be interviews or surveys with persons with lived experience, with their care partners, and so on. And so what the actual materials that we study can be through research can be very different and range from paperwork all the way to actual interactions with human beings. If I'm doing a search about what policies are in place to regulate dementia technology, which is something we just did recently, then we'll go looking for policy documents and policy statements. So there's a lot of different types of research, but the key thing is that we don't invent knowledge. We don't sort of make it up in our heads. We have to go and examine different types of sources. The next part of the definition I want to talk about is the fact that research is systematic. And what that means is we need to check all the boxes. We need to do things very rigorously and very thoroughly. So for example, in my example around policy documents, if I'm going to have a research question about policy, then I need to go look at all of the policies. I can't just pick one. And if I want to investigate what the lived experience of dementia is, then I need to talk to a lot of people, not just one person, because that's how we can get the best knowledge that's most representative of our environment and of the context in which we're conducting the research. The next part of the definition is essentially what research is for. And there's two parts to that in the definition. The first goal of research is to establish facts. So we want to know, for example, what is the best drug to treat dementia? Or we want to know, for example, what is the best way to use technology to support memory loss in our day-to-day activities. So we want to establish these facts. What are the best practices? What are people currently doing? What has an impact, positive or negative? So those are the kinds of facts that we're looking to answer. And then finally, the last part of the definition I want to go over is the fact that research allows us to reach new conclusions. So as I mentioned, we don't want to always ask and answer the same questions. We want to move the field forward. So we need to reach new conclusions. We can do that through innovative ways or through asking innovative questions about the various aspects of dementia, so that again we can create a new bit of knowledge that other researchers and scientists can then build on to ask the next question, and that's how we move the field forward. So those are the different aspects of what research is, although I also want to cover who does research. So there's two separate parts to that question. The first one is who pays for research, and the second one is who actually does the work. So there's many different types of funders for research, and I've listed some of them on the left-hand side of the slide. The government pays for a lot of research through government agencies, like, for example, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. They have funding bodies that essentially come from your taxes. And so essentially, if we ask who pays for research, is you. So through your taxes that go to our government, we fund a huge amount of very diversified research in Canada. Sometimes Canadians can get research funding from other countries as well. There's also the industry. So the sort of natural type of industry that people often think of in health research is the pharmaceutical industry. But there's also other types of industry that support research, like tech companies, for example. And so the industry funds research both within their industry, so scientists that are affiliated with the companies that do research, but they also fund research that takes place in other contexts, such as, for example, through universities. Universities themselves will fund some research through, again, a range of different opportunities for all different types of research, not just health research. Non-for-profit organizations fund research quite a bit, especially in Canada. So, for example, the Alzheimer Society of BC, who is hosting this webinar, funds researchers in British Columbia who are interested in advancing the field of dementia. And then finally, there's donors who also can fund research through a variety of mechanisms. A popular mechanism is through a donation to a university for the purpose of a specific type of research. So that's something that we see a lot. One message that I really want to get across here is that it's not often that we'll have a research project that will only have one type of funder. Oftentimes, when researchers do a project, they're getting funds from a couple of different sources. So you might be getting funds from the government, but also from an industry partner. Or maybe your university sponsored a little project, but also you're getting funds from a donor to supplement your budget. So oftentimes it's not clear cut. And sometimes the industry will provide funds to the government, who then in turn provides it to the researcher. So these relationships around funding are very complicated. But the important thing to note is that there isn't one funding body that's better than another. If you're doing research and you have funds to do it, then good for you. And there's not really a sort of better type of funder over a different type. And often, as I mentioned, often it's a collection of different sources that will fund a given project. Then the next question is who actually does the work? So we know who pays for it. There's a whole range of different people who conduct research. Obviously, researchers and scientists, and again, these can be affiliated with universities, but also with companies. Professors, university professors often do research, and this is a really funny scenario that we encounter quite a bit. So I'm an assistant professor at UBC, and people always ask me, what do you teach? And it's a bit of a misconception because I actually spend more of my time doing research than I do teaching, although I teach as well. But professors often spend a lot of time doing research. And then, of course, professors and scientists are tasked with training the next generation of researchers. And so we often have students in our teams. And these can be undergraduate students or graduate students or postdoctoral fellows. And so these often will take the lead on a research project. And so if you hear from a student, often they're under the supervision of a professor or a scientist. Healthcare providers also conduct research in a variety of settings. And then increasingly, we have the public doing some of the research work. And that takes very many different forms. You may have heard of initiatives that are called citizen science, in which members of the public are invited to participate in various different initiatives. We also increasingly involve people with lived experience in our research project as advisors, also as research participants. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think a growing body of opportunities for the public to become involved in a wide range of different types of research. So in terms of dementia research specifically, there's a number of different types of research, and I can't possibly list them all, but I have 4 sort of main categories of types of research that I want to mention. The first one that you're probably already aware of is pharmaceutical research. So looking to develop new drugs, looking to test new drugs, either for the prevention or for the treatment of various different forms of dementia. There's quite a bit of research in technology for persons with dementia and their care partners. This is something my lab is very interested in, and my next slide will be about that specifically, so I'm going to stop here on that topic. There's also a lot of research in sort of the human factors in dementia and what it's like to have dementia and how we can do a better job in creating dementia-friendly societies, and what that lived experience is like for people. So that's another type of dementia research. And then finally, there's also research that looks at the healthcare system as a whole and how we can better serve persons with dementia and their care partners. What are some of the existing services, how well they're working, and those sorts of questions. So there's many different types, and participating in these different types of research will be very different in what they look like and what it's like to participate in the studies, and so we'll cover that in just a minute. So I mentioned that technology research is one of the big areas for dementia research, certainly in Canada these days, and that's something, as I mentioned, that we're very interested in. So in our lab, we're looking at how people use online health information, for example, to make decisions about their health. We're looking at different types of robotics and how these can be useful. But we're also very interested in the ethics of these technologies and whether people feel like they benefit from them, or whether there are ethical issues or other considerations that sometimes we as researchers don't think about. And that's where it's very important to bring in members of the public and people with lived experience to provide these insights that we may not have. And at the very end of the presentation today, I'll say a few words about how to get involved in this type of work if that is of interest. So for the next few slides, I want to share with you some thoughts that were contributed by people who are very dear to me, who have participated in a range of studies, some that I've been involved with, but others that I haven't. And I reached out to 3 collaborators to obtain their perspectives on why they choose to participate in research. I think the best people who can tell you about why participate in research are people who actually participate in research. And so I'm going to read to you what they shared with me. And again, this is with my sincere thanks for their contribution. So the first statement is from Frank Everett, and he says that his family is beset with early onset Alzheimer's through my father. I was a teenager when I learned that I had a 50-50 chance of having this hereditary type of Alzheimer's. It absolutely affected my view of life, its possible brevity, and its disenchanting end, but in my 40s, I became more concerned about what it meant to my whole family. That was when I got involved in the research. I did not get involved for a solution for my generation. It was hopefully to find a solution by the time my children and nieces and nephews grew up. I understand that unless there is a lucky happenstance, research is mostly successful by reaching a critical mass, enough time, effort, money, and ideas to finally uncover the truth of such a disease. For my part, I thought it was important to add my time and effort as a mere drop in the ocean of time and effort needed to defeat this disease. I hope others do the same, adding momentum towards that critical mass. So Frank tells us he's participating in research because he wants to do his part, and he recognizes that this is a challenge that's going to be addressed by having a lot of different people coming in and participating to help find solutions. My second quote comes from Jim Mann, who's a terrific human being and very involved in advocacy around Alzheimer's disease, and he shares with us, "My involvement in research ensures the lived experience voice has provided a new perspective and knowledge base for the researcher that may even allow for more robust outcomes. I think it's fair to say many researchers have not interacted closely with people with dementia, so my involvement has shown them that many of us, after receiving our diagnosis, are still capable and able to contribute. The research field was new for me, and so I have enjoyed and valued the whole experience, especially working alongside the researchers." So Jim tells us that he's interested in providing his experience and his expertise to the researchers so that they can do better work. And he's absolutely correct in that absolutely we end up with better perspectives and more robust outcomes when we involve the people who are directly affected by this disease. And then finally, I have a few bullet points from Ian Goldman, who's a strong supporter of many projects under the AgeWell umbrella, which is a big organization that funds technology and aging research. And he tells us that he chooses to participate in research for three main reasons. The first one is for giving back and receiving. So giving back about his caregiving experience and teaching others about what that's been like for him, as well as learning new concepts and methods on his end. He finds research to be a meaningful activity with the hopes that the work will improve aging. And then he finds it's a good match for his personal interest in technology as a tool to improve aging and living with dementia, and also to help other caregivers. And so Ian tells us he's through research hoping to help others, but that he's also learning as part of the process, and that's been a meaningful activity for him. So now that we understand some people's motivations better to participate in research, I want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you what it's like to participate in research and what the different opportunities involve. So there are three levels of involvement, if you would like, in research. Some researchers invite people with lived experience and care partners and members of the public on a steering or an advisory level to provide general oversight around the research projects and to give a better idea of which directions the project should take and what is important and meaningful for the population of interest. And that's very important. There's a lot of opportunities to be involved on such advisories and committees, and they take many different forms. So sometimes it'll be committees that meet in person. Sometimes it'll be an e-panel where people can participate by email or by phone. So there's very many different types of opportunities to be involved on the oversight level. Then there's active participation in research. So becoming a participant in a given study. And that can take many different forms, which we'll talk about in just a minute. You can be involved in anything from pharmaceutical studies through technology studies, through sort of lived experience and sociology type work. And what you'll actually do as part of the research will vary greatly, and we'll cover what that might look like in just a minute as well. And then finally, some people participate in research in what I call a passive way when we do work, for example, that is observational in nature. So when we just want to observe what it's like, or when we collect information that people contribute in a passive way. So for example, we've done some work looking at what people share publicly and freely on social media. And that's a way that people end up being involved in research without sort of actively going in and interacting with the researcher. So there's a typical process to most research projects, and I'll go over the different steps of this process right now, although keep in mind that it's not a perfect recipe, and sometimes research projects are a little bit different. But typically, if you're interested in becoming involved in research, the first step is a first contact with the research team. And that can take many different forms. Sometimes they can give you a call, or sometimes you might get an email that says, well, you're eligible for this study. You may hear about a research study from your physician, from a nurse, from a healthcare provider. You may read about it online, sometimes in newsletters. We use newsletters a lot to recruit people into various research projects. Or you may hear about research at an event, such as during this webinar, or through friends or family that may have heard about it in their community. And usually after this first contact, there's an invitation to get in touch with the researcher, and then you can find out more about the study. And again, that can be on the phone or via email or in person. So you can find out more about the study that way and then decide whether you want to participate or not. If you're interested in participating, the next step is called consent. And that means that you have to agree to be in a research study after being made aware of all the potential benefits and all the potential risks of the study. So for example, if we're testing a new drug, there might be some side effects, some risks of side effects and things like that. If we're doing an interview where you're going to just talk about your experience, then the risks are going to be different and the benefits are also going to be different. So in the consent process, the researcher or the student or a research assistant will sit down with you and they'll explain what the research involves, everything that you'll be expected to do as part of the research project. They'll explain what the benefits to you might be, and sometimes there aren't any, so that's something that's important to know, and all the potential risks, and sometimes those risks are also very minimal, so that's also something that varies a lot. And then usually you'll be asked to sign a consent form or provide verbal consent, say, yes, I agree that I want to do this. Sometimes if it's an online survey, you may read it online and then click a tick box that says, I agree, and move on that way. So I've put a one page here as an icon on my slide that shows a sort of an X and a line as to where you would sign. But in reality, oftentimes the consent process is much longer than one page. And that's a little bit unfortunate. But it's very important that we give you really all the information that you need to make a decision about whether you want to participate or not. And sometimes in order to provide all that information, we need more than one page. And so I encourage you to think of the consent as sort of a necessary process and to actually read the fine print and not do what we normally do when we sign up for iTunes or something like that and just scroll through everything really quickly and say, I agree. But really take this opportunity to learn more, to ask a lot of questions. That's also a time when you can ask questions about the research process. And then finally provide your consent or not, depending on what you've decided to do. I can tell you that reading long forms is burdensome and annoying, and everybody agrees that that's the case. And so as a research community, we're working really hard right now to work with regulatory bodies to simplify this process and to create consenting processes that are shorter and easier to understand. And so we definitely know that this is needed, and we're working towards that, and some really nice initiatives in BC recently that are suggesting that in the very near future we'll be able to provide a much simplified process. But for now, if you encounter a consent process that seems very lengthy to you, please know that the researchers likely agree with you, but are there to answer every question, and hope that you will find the information that you need through this process. So once you've consented, if you've consented and have agreed to participate in research, then the next stage of the research is the actual intervention or the actual experiment. And that can take very many different forms, and it can have very many different timelines. Sometimes you'll be involved in a research project for 10 years, for 20 years. But sometimes it's a one-time event. You fill out a survey or you have a phone conversation, and that's the end of the project. So it really depends. And there's an organization in the UK that has created a wonderful slide that shows you examples of what taking part in a study might involve. So you might be in a study where you have to track your nutrition or change your nutrition. You might be in a study that requires you to make lifestyle changes like exercise. Your study might be a drug trial that involves a new pharmaceutical agent. Sometimes you might be asked to simply fill out a questionnaire, and we're currently doing a study in partnership with the Alzheimer Society of BC where we created a questionnaire about the First Link program in the province, and we want to hear people's thoughts about the program, and so we're doing that through an online questionnaire. And please stay tuned if you might be interested in in helping us out with this project. Other research projects may involve cognitive tests. Sometimes they may involve you having to go to the hospital or to a clinic to get a brain scan, for example. So there's many different types of things that you might do. In our lab, we're very interested in technology and robots, and so chances are for our research projects, either we would come to you or you would come to us, and we'd interact with the technology and sort of capture your thoughts about what that's like for you, what you think is missing, or how we can develop better tools. So there's a lot of different types of studies, and as I mentioned, your involvement can follow many different timelines. Some studies are very long, some studies are very short. Some studies you can do from the comfort of your home. It can take place all through online or phone modalities. Some you have to go to a research site or to a hospital or another location to complete the work. So there's a lot of different types of research, and all that information about what the study involves and how long it takes and what procedures you need to undergo, all of that is in your consent form, and it should tell you every step of the way what you'll be expected to do as part of a project. So the last 3 steps I've put all together in the one slide. So the first one, or the fourth one, I guess, is assessment. So once there's been an intervention and once you've participated in the project, we often, though not always, want to evaluate how well that worked. How well did the drug work, or how well did the technology help? How well did the lifestyle program change your quality of life, for example? And that will take place in the form of an assessment. Sometimes the assessment is a couple of questions in an online questionnaire, and sometimes it's a lengthy in-person process, or as I mentioned, might involve some blood work or some brain scans, and that really depends a lot on the study that you're involved with. And same as the intervention and the experiments, all the details about the assessment and how those will be conducted will be listed in your consent form. Sometimes researchers use what we call validated assessment tools. So we use the same tool with everybody. And these tools have been shown to give us meaningful information about one aspect of your health or well-being. And sometimes we use custom tools that we've developed specifically for the study, specifically to ask the question that we're interested in. And you might not ever take that assessment again after the study is over. Oftentimes at the end of various studies, there'll be a debrief. Researchers will want to know how it went for you. They'll want to know what they can do better. And they'll want to know sort of how your experience was as a research participant. And then finally, at the end of most studies, there'll be some knowledge translation. Sometimes you can indicate to the researcher that you want to hear the results from the study, in which case you'll receive a follow-up email or newsletter or phone call to tell you what they found. And then sometimes the dissemination will take place in other forms, maybe as posts on social media or maybe as in-person events in the community where you may find out what happened with the research project. So there's different ways people transfer the knowledge that they've acquired through the research. But if you indicate that you want to hear back about what the study found, then most certainly the researchers will be in touch once it's over. One word of caution, however, is that research takes a long time and it's a long process. And so sometimes you may participate in a study and the researchers won't have final data or final results until many, many months, sometimes years later. And that's perfectly normal. It's very annoying. I absolutely agree with you. But that's just the nature of the process. And so sometimes if you participate in a study, you might not hear right away about what the researchers found. So now that we've covered what research is like, I want to talk a little bit about what you should look for when you're reading about research on the internet. There's a lot of information out there about different studies and what they found and what the implications of those studies are for you and for your health. And it's important to look at that with the critical lens. And I know that now that we've talked about what research looks like, you have a better sense of the different ways in which we do research. But I want to add some more advice on how to tease out the information that you may read about and how to determine if it's good quality or bad quality information. So I want to start by showing you examples of headlines about research that you may find in the media. The first example of a headline is this one, which reads, "New Alzheimer's treatment fully restores memory function." This is a headline that was published on a website called David Avocado Wolf. And in this article, they claim that there's a new treatment, as you can see from the headline. I'm afraid to tell you this is fictional. This is a true headline in the news, but it's unfortunately not true that there is a new Alzheimer's treatment. This media organization was especially misleading in putting a picture of a person with the headline, because this was actually referring to a study that was done in mice, in animals. And they found a procedure had an impact on one small aspect of memory in the mice, but we're far, far ways away from being able to translate any of that into humans. And it's definitely a technique that the research community is following up on. It's called focused ultrasound, and there are some trials, but absolutely not true that this treatment fully restores memory in people with Alzheimer's. It's not, we didn't even, the study that this headline is referring to didn't look at people at all. It only looked at mice. And so it's important to know that research done in mice can have important, can generate important new knowledge that we absolutely need to build on, but we can't take results from things that were done in very small rodents and assume that the same will work for humans, because as most of you can tell, we're actually very different from mice. So a second headline that I want to show you is my favorite example of a science communication fail. And it's this one. It reads, "Salad dressing good for the brain, new study shows." And if you've seen me speak before in the community, you've seen this before, because it's my favorite and I always show it. So this headline comes to us from a study that was done in 2010. Before I get into the study, salad dressing is not actually good for your brain, so don't go pour yourself a glass of ranch right now. It's not going to work. So what this study that the article is referring to did is they looked at the foods that people eat and their risk of developing dementia many years later. And it was actually a really neat study, and they took thousands of people and they asked them to keep a very detailed food journal for some amount of time. And then they followed these people over many years and then looked at what the different people ate and whether they developed dementia many years later, as I mentioned. And what they ended up doing is creating two lists of foods. One list of foods that are associated with an increase in your risk of developing dementia, and then one list of foods that's associated with a decrease in your risk of developing dementia. And the findings show what most of you probably expect and already know. Vegetables are good for you. Butter is not good for you. So it was a little bit of common sense, although the article, when it came out, definitely was in support of a Mediterranean diet, right? So vegetables and fish and legumes and those kinds of things. But the interesting thing about the headline is that there's some journalist who looked at these lists of foods and looked in the list of foods that are good for you and picked out salad dressing, completely missing the point that people who ate salad dressing probably also ate a lot of salad, and it's actually the salad that's good for your brain, of course. So that's a perfect example of how sometimes research projects can be misconstrued or misrepresented in the news media, and in particular on the internet. And then finally, the last headline I want to share with you, which is also one of my favorites, is this one from a study in 2015, and it reads, "Drinking 3 glasses of champagne every week could prevent dementia." Wouldn't that be nice? It would also be very expensive. Of course, this is not true. This also is a study that was done in mice. They did not feed the mice champagne. They gave them this one chemical compound that is found in champagne. So definitely not the same as humans drinking champagne. So unfortunately, that story is not true. So how do we make sense of all these different headlines and of all the information and of the impact this information can have? So if we go online or if we go into the newspaper and we encounter high quality information, we're more likely to make a good decision, like start an exercise program, and end up having a good health outcome, feeling better, lowering our blood pressure. On the other hand, if we consult low quality resources like this article about drinking champagne, then we're more likely to make a bad decision, like spending all our money on champagne, and then resulting in a bad health outcome as a result of drinking too much alcohol, as well as bad financial outcome in spending all this money on Dom Pérignon. So it's important to make sure that people encounter high quality resources, and so then it's also very important that people can tell what is a good quality resource and what is a bad quality resource. And even us as researchers and even experts in neurology sometimes can have a hard time when they go online in determining what's a good resource and what's not a good resource. So this is a very challenging task. And so we were interested in measuring the quality of the resources that people look at when they go online. And so we developed a tool to do that. It's called the Quest for Quality Evaluation Scoring Tool. And it looks at 6 criteria that are listed on the slide, but I'll go into each of these one by one. So just as an overview, the 6 criteria is authorship, currency, conflict of interest, complementarity, tone, and attribution. And I know some of these words maybe don't make sense. They certainly wouldn't to me if I didn't do this research. And so I'll describe them in a little more detail one at a time. So the first criteria to look for is authorship, and that's essentially who wrote the information. If you're looking at a report from research online and there's no name of an author or even a username, and it just says something like, well, it's from the University of British Columbia, that's what I call a red light. So that's probably not a very reputable source of information. There are a lot of people at the University of British Columbia, and not all of them are qualified to make a statement on Alzheimer's disease, for example. If an author is listed, that is better. So if the article tells you, well, it's by Luisa Sanchez, well, that's better than no name or no author. The best scenario for authorship is if you can see an author and their qualifications. So if it's by Dr. Sanchez or Luisa Sanchez, MD, and you know and you can tell, okay, Dr. Sanchez, she went to medical school, and so probably she can talk about medicine more so than somebody who did a different type of qualification. So always look for who wrote the information and whether they're qualified to contribute that information. The second criteria in the Quest tool is called currency, and essentially how old is the information, or conversely, how current is the information. If there's no date, that's not a good sign. Research moves really fast, and what we believed 20 years ago is no longer really what we believe today, especially when it comes to prevention and nutrition and lifestyle. All of that research moves very fast. If there is a date on the information, but it's more than 5 years old, when it comes to brain health, that's something to be not necessarily concerned about, but just know that maybe since then there's been new advances in the field. And then finally, things that are dated within the last 5 years are usually best. So those are usually the best types of resources or the most current information. The third criteria is called conflict of interest, and that essentially asks, is the site trying to sell you something? If the site is trying to sell you products or services for prevention or treatment of disease, then that's a red flag. So an example of that would be a website that would say, well, if you want to reduce your risk of stroke, you should take supplements of folic acid, and conveniently, if you click on this link, you can purchase this supplement straight from our online store. So that's predatory. So that is sort of marketing under the guise of education. So you want to be very careful with any website that's directly trying to sell you something. We found in our sample that some websites are trying to sell you products or services that are sort of educational in nature. So things like books or long-term care services, for example, and those tend to be slightly better. But the very best quality websites are not trying to sell you anything, not a product, not a service, not a book. They're just providing information for educational purposes. The next criteria in the Quest is whether the information on the website supports your relationship with your healthcare provider. If they say things like talk to your doctor before taking supplements, or talk to your doctor before changing your diet drastically, that's a good sign. If it doesn't support that relationship, or worse, if it undermines it, if it says things like, well, your doctor might not even know about this special treatment, that's definitely a red flag. your doctor will know what the best treatment is, and researchers will know. And so if anybody's claiming to have a secret cure or a secret, now we see this a lot with weight loss products, right? Oh, a secret new weight loss supplement that your doctor doesn't even know about. That's usually almost always false information or predatory marketing. So you definitely want to encounter information that really supports you having a relationship with your healthcare provider. The next criteria in the Quest tool is called tone, and it's asking if the information is balanced. If the article is using research to make really strong claims with words like can cure or guarantee or it's easy, always be very skeptical of things that are easy. That's usually a red flag. If the article or if the website is using more cautious vocabulary, saying things like can reduce your risk or may help prevent, that's better. In the best case, you're looking for information that's balanced and that shows the limitations or the criticism of the research. So things like in contrast or more research is needed. That's the kind of vocabulary that's associated with the best quality information. And then finally, the last criteria on the Quest tool is whether the claims are supported. So are they telling you you should eat blueberries because they feel like it, or are they telling you you should eat blueberries because research supports this as a method? So if there's no sources, if there's no mention of an expert, of a study, of anything like that, that's a red flag. If the article mentions expert sources, so things like a physician who may recommend this or another type of expert, that's better. What is best is if in the article there's a reference to at least one scientific study, so you know it's coming from research. And I'll share with you next what I mean by an identifiable scientific study. So that means that in the article you can tell one of those four things, either who did the research, so a study by Dr. Julie Robillard, that works, or the university or the company where the study was done. So Dr. Julie Robillard, who did a study at the University of British Columbia, that's great. Sometimes the article might say where the study was published. So for example, a study that was published this year in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, that's also a good sign. Or if you can actually just find the name of the study. So many research studies have names, or we often like acronyms. So for example, the Canadian Longitudinal Study in Aging, in the article, if they report findings from the study, they may name the study, and then you know, because you can look this up and you can search what the Canadian Longitudinal Study in Aging is. So it doesn't have to have all four of these characteristics, but at least one of these that could help you trace back where the research was done or who did the research is always helpful. So what we found, of course, in our analysis of the quality of articles about Alzheimer's disease is that there was a huge variation in quality. And we found about 10% of the articles online that were very good quality information that would lead to positive health changes. And then we found about 10% of the articles that were very bad and very low quality information, and that included either fraudulent marketing or predatory marketing or things like that. We also found in this study that 1 in 5 websites are trying to sell you something. So you know that means probably it's a low quality piece of information. We looked at the different types of tone, and that sort of overlaps with the slide with the traffic light. But essentially, if the website is making a strong recommendation, for example, if you're serious about the prevention of Alzheimer's, you should definitely take a vitamin, and that's usually a red flag. Sometimes websites may make a simple recommendation and say, well, findings indicate that an active social life may help prevent Alzheimer's disease. That's better. And then what's best is if the advice is balanced. So if the website says things like some research has shown this, but it's not clear, or but we need more information, that's usually what you want to look for. So we're almost at the end here. Just before we wrap up, so we found in our study that high quality articles were more likely to recommend things like controlling your weight, stopping smoking, controlling your blood pressure and your blood sugar, And of course, low quality information about Alzheimer's disease was more likely to recommend things like eating a type of food, more or less, more coffee, less coffee, eating specific nutrients, or taking supplements. And of course, the difference between the top row and the bottom row is that it's a lot harder to follow the advice in the top row. It's a lot harder to lose weight than it is to just simply add blueberries to your diet. So if it sounds too easy to be true, then it probably is. So just to wrap up, I want to share with you some things to look for that will indicate whether the resource that you're looking at is of good quality or of bad quality. So indicators of good quality include things like whether the resource is recommended by your physician, a healthcare provider, or a trusted source. So things like Health Canada or the Alzheimer's Society of BC that you know personally to be a trusted source. The information is balanced, so we talked a little bit about what type of language they should use. They should be cautious. If you can find that an author is listed along with credentials and contact information, that's ideal. And then if you can find some references that support the claims in the article, or a study or features of a study, that's also ideal. And then finally, some red flags. So things like claims of guarantees is always a bad sign. There are no guarantees in this world other than death and taxes. So anything that guarantees you anything, especially when it comes to brain health or aging, be very, very skeptical. Strong words in the same vein, so strong words like cure or completely reverse. If there's a breakthrough, you'll hear it from us, I promise you. So be very skeptical of that kind of language. Any requirements to enter personal information, so any website that needs you to put in your name or needs you to sign up for a newsletter before you can access the information, that's definitely a red flag. Good quality information is free and you shouldn't have to enter any personal information to get to it. We already talked about this. If there's a sale or an endorsement of a product, that's definitely a red flag. And then finally, if the advice appears to go against the consensus, so if you go on 10 websites and 9 of them say you should exercise, and one of them tells you that you can take it easy, probably the correct answer is that exercise is the right idea. So just before I take a few questions, I want to invite you to participate in research. So it's only with your participation that we can do good work and move the field forward. And so if you're listening and you've been inspired by some of the work that I've discussed, or you'd like to pitch in, I invite you to be in touch either with myself directly or with my wonderful research assistant, Mallory Tam. So definitely feel free to contact us if you have any questions. We'll be happy to answer them and share with you the different ways in which you can be involved. And so now is time for a few questions. I know I went a little bit long, but we still have a few minutes for questions. So I know the Alzheimer's Society of BC, they're wonderful people, are online with me right now and moderating the questions that are coming in through the chat, if there are any. So if you have any questions, excuse me, feel free to type them into the chat. Or to unmute your line and ask them to the group if you prefer. I see some questions are coming in. While people are typing, if there's anybody who wants to ask a question to the group, you can unmute your line briefly and ask away. Okay, so there's a question that came in that's asking what drugs are being prescribed by doctors now for Alzheimer's. And so thank you for that question. There's 2 classes of drugs that are currently approved for Alzheimer's disease, although there's ongoing research in trying to develop more. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into the details of what these two drugs are and what they do, but I do encourage you to speak with your physician. And I believe the Alzheimer's Society also has some information on their website about what the standard treatments are. So I have a second question saying, why is there an age limit of 50 and up for participating in research? That's an excellent question. I should mention that we are looking for people who are 50 years or older to provide some lived experience perspectives to the research project, but we're also interested in the experience of care partners and the involvement of care partners. So if you're younger than 50 but identify as a care partner, we also definitely want to hear from you. The reason we set the 50 years and over is sort of to really examine issues that are specific to older adults and essentially future older adults, of which we all are, of course, and my parents would probably not be very pleased that I set the bar so low. But essentially we're interested in sort of the process of aging, and so that's why we want to talk to people who are 50 or older. But as I mentioned, if you work with older adults, either in a caregiving capacity or in a professional capacity, you're eligible for the studies we're doing in my lab as well. I also want to mention that these eligibility criteria on the slide right now are specific to the studies that we're doing in my lab, but in other labs at UBC, at SFU, and elsewhere around the province, people might have different studies where the inclusion criteria is different. For example, where you need to be younger because they're looking at a specific method for prevention, for example. And so I encourage you to connect with the Alzheimer's Society and directly with the research community if you can to find opportunities that may be best suited for yourself. I have another question coming in. I'm trying to sort of answer them fairly quickly, but if you have any follow-up questions, definitely feel free to be in touch by email, and I can answer best I can, or at least point you in the direction of someone who could. So we have another question that says, if I'm interested in donating funds for research, how would you recommend doing this? I think my best advice for that would be to speak with the Alzheimer's Society of BC, who is generously hosting this webinar. I know they are set up to develop these kinds of relationships and partnerships between the community and the research. And so I would encourage you to be in touch with them, and they would definitely be able to either assist with that or direct you in the right direction. There is another question that came in saying, earlier today there was an article published about by the BBC about successful brain restoration in pigs, and how could lead to advancements in Alzheimer's research. Am I aware of this, and can you comment? I have not seen this specific article, as I have been preparing this webinar for most of my morning, but I guess my immediate thoughts is, well, first of all, who wrote the article? Second of all, how current is the information, et cetera, et cetera. But in all seriousness, work that's done in animal models can absolutely further our understanding of Alzheimer's, of the brain, of Alzheimer's research. And sometimes we learn about some treatments that are successful in animal models, and then years down the road, they end up being successful treatments for humans. So I guess I would say that's hopeful news if that information is of high quality. That's great to have hopeful news based on different model organisms, but to also keep in mind that the translational pathway, the time it takes from when we learn something in animal models, excuse me, until the time when it actually becomes useful in humans, sometimes that path is very long. Sometimes it can take many years before we're able to use similar techniques or even similar drugs in humans. So it's great that there's hope on the horizon, but of course we need to remain patient. So with that, it's 2:59, so I'm going to just steal the last minute to thank all of you for participating, for attending today, and very sincere thanks to the Alzheimer's Society of BC for this opportunity for me to share with you about research, about the research that we're doing. I invite you to connect with them and with myself if you have follow-up questions, and I'm very grateful for your attention.